that too on the participants page. If you need to.
Okay. So, welcome to our Agri webinar, everyone. My name's Oren Chisholm. I'm the Program Director for the Pharmaceutical and Medical Device Development Programs at the University of Sydney in Australia. This webinar is hosted by Agri, and Agri is the Association of the Graduate Regulatory Educators, and we're an international group of educators that teach regulatory affairs in our various programs. So I'm very pleased to welcome you all today to our webinar, and we're going to be talking about the regulation of medical devices. Dr. Gert is joining us from Europe, and he will be speaking about the European medical device regulations, and then Ebrahim Najjar, who's a student at Arizona State University, will be joining us to talk about his research looking at the regulation of medical devices in the Middle East and North Africa region. So I'm going to hand over to Gert to start his presentation. Thank you, Gert.
So excellent, Oren, and thank you for the nice introduction and for actually inviting me to speak in this forum. So it's a pleasure to do so. Always very happy to support any education and anyone with a passion into regulatory sciences. I'll be sharing a couple of slides. They will also be shared later on as well. And so don't mind if you miss some of the details. I use kind of pictures basically, and you should be able to see them now. Just, yeah, there we go. So I use them as pictures, but there might be some text on it as well. I'm not going to repeat everything, but you can read it later on once you have the time to go through some of the details. So I'd like to explain to you a little bit where we are at this stage and why we are at this stage with the European medical device regulations, how we came to be there, and what is going to be next. And of course, in the presentation, you will see a bit of history about me, and very important, the fact that we just try and give our best interpretations, but that is what it is. I'd like to take you back into history a little bit. Why do we have this EUMDR in the first place? And this started in 2007. And you see here a picture of how legislation in Europe is being made. This is the current picture of a co-decision procedure. And that actually changed in 2007, just at the time that the current legislation, the MDD, was last revised by the member states. Until then, either the European Parliament could initiate, and they would do that with new law, or the members of the countries could initiate changes to law. And that's what always had happened for 45 years. From that moment on, the European Commission could basically initiate legislation, and they did so with a lot of power. And that's where some of the confusion started, because different parties had to agree, but didn't agree to the fact that we would have new legislation. They had just finished legislation, and now all of a sudden a new power, the European Commission, said it has to be done again. And why did they do that? For a couple of reasons. And I'll explain that a little bit so that you understand, because that's the basic of understanding what's happening and what you have to do. The first objective was to get rid of the member states' policy making, because the current legislation had legislation in every country which was different. So the interpretation was on a member states level, and they wanted to get that control and make sure that the agreement on what it means, what the law means, is done by central European systems. And that is actually causing now this huge delay on getting guidances, and we'll talk about that in a couple of slides. Second thing is that the changes that were made in the last revisions forgot one thing, and that is to get the economic operators in. Some of the big changes, legal changes to the new MDR, include different stakeholders other than the manufacturers. And so there was another reason to just move over. And so basically what they said is that we want the legislation to continue to have the CE marking in Europe. That's the middle bullet. Of course, the legislation had to be adjusted to state of art after a couple of decades, the last bullet. But then you see here in the formal wording from the European Commission, the EU citizens need to be protected. And before that, it was the national citizens for each country separately. So it's a change of power, and that meant a power struggle that basically was what we saw and still see today. Of course, these words that are in this first commission paper, you don't see that in the MDR. You see words like sufficient clinical data and liability and economic operator enhancements and so on and so on. But the essence of these 3 bullet points is throughout the legislation. Now, what happened, of course, and you must have seen that in your in being part of society, there were a lot of issues, and especially also in Europe, there were some fraud cases and big problems with a number of implants and so on. So as we were building the legislation, the major shift already appeared. Notified bodies were being treated differently. The market approval became stricter. The authorities became stricter in market approval and so on. So a lot of the essence of what we wanted to achieve with the MDR already at this stage have been implemented by just pushing and not allowing the slack control that was, at least if we look back, the situation 20, 25 years ago. So we started back in 2012 in the middle of this chaos with fraud cases, breast implant cases, and so on and so on. We had years of debates between Council, Parliament, and Commission. You say, why do we have to go back to this history? Because the history comes back in that sense. Parliament agreed to a lot of things. They went silent afterwards. But in the background, they're starting to prepare now the pharmaceutical legislation, and some changes to the medical device legislation might be added in the new pharmaceutical law in the next few years. Council, so the member state, basically continued because they have to provide all the content. So all the guidances are developed by the council members, by the member states, and the Commission only kind of supervises that system. So struggle of power, whomever won or lost back in the days, now the power struggle is different. So legislation was published, many more articles. I hope you have read it. Once again, well, if you read from start to finish, I guess everyone will be falling asleep. What you have to do is start to study the legislation in Europe if you haven't done so. And if you haven't done so, you have to get started. I would say, well, start with the 101 bullet points at the start, the why, the whereas. That basically gives you the picture and what you have to do and what the intention was and so on and so on. So if you have like half an hour, that's what you should read. And I would say that that's your executive summary. The second, of course, is the chapters, the articles, what you have to do, and then the annexes, how you have to do. And what we see is that they have been written by different people and approved at different moments in time, sometimes with a year, 2 year in between. And so they're not consistent. So there's a lot of inconsistencies if you go through and if you were to read all these pages at the same time. So what you do? So basically, if you have inconsistencies and you have to study hard to find everything related to the topic you're looking at, whether it's kind of on toxicity or on clinical data or on biocompatibility, whatever you're looking for, search for everything in the law, then look for consistencies and inconsistencies. And then basically you follow, in first instance, what is in the articles. And the second, if you can, you follow what's in the annexes on the how to do it. And if there's still a debate, well, you can always go back to, well, what was the intention? But basically, the intention of the law and what legislators try to get in is not relevant anymore. So now you really have to go back and study what exactly the wording is, what would be a legal interpretation. And that's where we see a lot of differences, especially manufacturers that started very early, that had their MDR certificates early. They basically got the approvals based on the intention of the law because they were the early adopters. What you now see with them is that they have to go back and revisit all of their dossiers to keep the products on the market because the interpretation is changing and shifting. And hopefully a lot of the big changes we've seen, and we're getting into a little bit more stable waters, but that continues, and I'm sure to some extent it will continue in the next few years. So even though we will get more and more guidance, it is a moving target that everyone's preparing to. So the what and the how we've seen. So if you then look at the key changes that we have, just to get that into the picture, basically it's not that different. And now you're going to say, well, how can you say that? Because we went from a couple of pages to a few hundred pages, and everyone's complaining about it and so on. But truly, if you look at a very strict interpretation of the old legislation with all the guidances and just say, well, whatever was in the guidances to your best interpretation is now in the law, then you're 99% ready. Much more focus on clinical, on post-market surveillance, on continuous process as well. That was already in guidances, in the ISO 13485 quality system standard, and so on and so on. We see a stricter control on high-risk devices. And of course, the notified body, they spend much more time. And what happens if a dossier reviewer spends more time on a dossier, reads the pages twice instead of skipping through them, they find more details, they find more inconsistencies, and that's what you have seen. Really debates about if it's good enough, if it's safe enough, or a product need to be redesigned. We haven't seen much of that. It is the details of what has been documented, the consistency between what people write in their risk management and their clinical plans and the final evaluations, validations, and so on. And that's where most of the core issues are. And of course, it's a scary thing if you know that you might get 200 deficiencies. So trying to prepare as good as you can is what most manufacturers are doing. And that causes a delay and therefore a waiting list at the site of the manufacturers, between the manufacturers and the notified body. A couple of products have been added to the scope, and that's kind of a European thing. We have all kinds of legislation on food and all kinds of other products, and then we don't like certain type of devices in the food, so we move them elsewhere. And the manufacturers of these kind of in-between products, gray zone products, they shift from legislation to legislation. And of course, also the medical device regulation took that opportunity, and every legislation basically does that, to redefine the gray zones between the different type of products and combination products. Essentially, the big change that is happening inside the European thinking is transparency. Getting a central database, it's being built, will take forever. But once it's there, there will be a lot of new visibility to everyone, to stakeholders, to journalists, to competitors, to patients. Everyone will see the essence of what manufacturers have done. And that's a scary thing as well. And then in some cases, we've had some reclassifications. But overall, we see a change also in the system, not only in the content of what manufacturers have to deliver, but there's much more strictness, and they're being scared. Basically, notified bodies, they don't want to be your best friend anymore. They're very strict and tight because they don't know exactly what the minimum requirements will be. Transparency improved, as I mentioned, and coordination between member states has also dramatically improved. So if you now have a vigilance case, for instance, in the past, you would have send it in, and maybe 1 or 2 countries would have sent you, well, thank you for sending it in letter. By now, you would get 10 or 15 countries to just ask questions. And they keep on asking questions for a month or 3 until they're satisfied that everything has been done. They will be asking much more details. They want documents to be translated into their language and so on and so on. They then share that between themselves. So that whole supervision on the market is really time consuming, but hopefully will also lead to more trust in the system. One of the core issues, of course, is getting everything done again. The dossiers need to be reviewed again. The audits need to be done from scratch. The notified bodies have to be designated again. And by now, we are already like 4 years into the transition period. We should have had everything finished, but still we're like midway getting the notified body designated. And this is a figure from half a year ago, and I just didn't update it for the purpose of me saying, well, we had 27 notified bodies then. Now it's 6 months later. We have 29 today. And you can see that still a lot of them are in application. So this process is extremely slow. That means that if you or a friend that you work with or manufacturer you're supporting or whomever you hear in the system, beware not to trust anyone that says it will be all right in the future, right? People are really in panic mode if your notified body hasn't been designated, or if your designated notified body hasn't accepted your approval process to get started. It is time to really start calling friends and getting on the roll, because the time is almost finished. And if manufacturers are not yet being reviewed at this stage, it's almost too late. Trouble, of course, is that the scope has been reduced for a lot of notified bodies. So even where a trusted notified body was doing a product approval for a manufacturer, they went on for years and years with solid certificates. All of a sudden, you see that when the designation is in place, even if they applied for certain products, they might not have received the designation they applied for. And that's an issue as well, because then all of a sudden you have to start shifting and finding another notified body. Why do you read, and you probably read in the papers, in regulatory fora and so on, that this is going to be a massive breakdown in Europe? That is because of these huge delays in getting manufacturers to submit the dossiers. But there's a little bit more than that. We've had 1 year delay into the system to make room for the pandemic, to make sure that in that critical period, there was continuous access in Europe to products that the hospitals would need to control the pandemic. Because many of them are class 1 products and they would otherwise have had to fulfill the MDR requirements, and nobody had time for that. What also happened is that because of that delay, almost all manufacturers renewed their certificates for another period, which means that all the certificates currently available in Europe almost all have the same expiry date. So even if the notified bodies have enough, and they don't have enough resources to do all the reviews, they still wouldn't be able to handle that massive workload that all will happen in 2024 in 1 year. So that's the big thing that everyone's working against, and hopefully there will be solutions. The European Commission is now asking everyone to be creative, and as you're also in the academic setting, your students, you're mighty creative. If you have any thoughts on how they can solve the problem without just grandfathering everything in, just send a letter to well, anyone concerned or to the European Commission. They will actually be listening to you. So they're scrambling for smart people to come up and find solutions. On the other hand, simple solutions are sometimes legally not possible. In the whole pandemic, we have not been able to do a lot of audits because the law simply says that the audit has to be done on site. So things like that sometimes are really a bottleneck, and they create trouble. So here's the slide with the final timelines until, well, the 26th of May 2024, when everything has to be done and dusted. So that's less than 2 years from now. If you then look at the average time for an assessment of a medium risk file, that's actually kind of more than a year. Higher risk files is more than a year and a half. So in the next couple of months, if manufacturers don't get their dossiers in with a notified body so that the process starts, they will not get a certificate in time. And by now, not only the regulators and the manufacturers are starting to see that, but the first few hospitals are starting to scream and say, well, we've seen in the pandemic what it is if we have to close the hospital. We have to find solutions to be able to continue to serve the patients also in the 24-25 timeframe. Harmonization of standards, one easy way to ensure that manufacturers know what to do and just follow the standard and you're close to the compliance, has been delayed, and so on. So by now we have a few standards, critical horizontal standards, harmonized. So that's a good start. And hopefully in the next few months, we'll get a lot of the standards harmonized. There were some legal battles, there were some discrepancies of opinions, and luckily that has been solved. So by now we are going to expect a lot of these standards to be available. In case standards would not be available, we would have this new thing called common specifications. Not a lot of them were written down, actually only one. on reprocessing of single-use devices. But this will be something for the future, where in time there will be product-specific guidance, basically, like the US FDA has, and they will be written by a central group of experts, and they will come in the form of legislation called common specifications. So meanwhile, we have seen a lot of guidance that has been published, over 70, 80 guidance documents, but many of them are on getting the system running. And so by now, finally, we are starting to see the first guidances actually on what is good enough, what is the end goal, how should our products be validated, rather than how do we get the logistics of the whole new system up and running. And so that's what everyone has been waiting for. And with some of these latest Q&A documents and how are we going to do this and what does enough sufficient clinical data mean and so on, we're finally making improvements on that alignment of what is good enough. And so the good news is for the last couple of months, when some of these guidances have come out finally, you see a relaxation also in the interaction between manufacturers and the notified bodies reviewing the dossiers. You see that there's a bit more trust on what is good enough because the guidance is starting to be a little bit more specific on some of these vague concepts. So another thing that is being set up, and hopefully you and your friends are not working on very highly innovative products, but of course a lot of universities are involved with innovative products. High risk innovative products have to go through kind of an additional layer of clinical review by Central European clinical experts. That system is being set up, and so you have to be a little bit patient if you have to go in that route. But it's being set up. A lot of experts are being finalized. The coordination is now with the Central Drug Agency. They have the systems in place, and they start to roll out this in the next couple of months. The EUMD is being developed, so this is a central electronic database with a number of modules, as you can see here, with different levels of access to different stakeholders. A lot of the modules are now going live, or they are in the sandbox. So that really makes space for actually getting some of the data working and running. So we try and summarize where we are. If we look at, and this is another publication from the Commission website in a nutshell, you can see that the most of the elements that are not highlighted here, that's basically where we know what we have to do. The processes have been improved, things have been clarified. Where most of the debates currently are is still in the final thing of getting that clinical evidence in one of the core changes. Getting that into this mixture. Well, post-market data, post-market clinical follow-up has been kind of what people have done in the past couple of years to collect data whilst their products are on the market. But time is running out for that, as dossiers now have to go to the notified body in the next 6 to 12 months. There hardly is time to start collecting additional data. So you see the struggle people have to collect such data. And so I would say that's the core issue at this moment. While hospitals, as they are now slowly getting out of the pandemic, they have a little bit more time for helping out manufacturers to collect data. And you see that running clinical studies, that's way too expensive, way too time consuming. Hardly anyone is doing that at this stage. Trying to retrospectively analyze patient records and so on, kind of what we have in the middle, the italic wording, getting some real world evidence, but tracking what has been done, looking at patient files and then analyzing, doing some of that smart review and reflection in well set up surveys is what people are trying to do, to just get in within a couple of months to get some clinical data and then hope that that's sufficient to get through that debate. It would have been so easy if I could have sent you one website where you can find all the information from the European Commission. You can see here that I've listed 5 to get you started. These 5 websites, and luckily they have RSS feeds and so on, so you can sign yourself up to get the updates. This is basically a link to where you can find some of the core development guidances, 2 rolling plans from the authorities and the European Commission. So again, these 2 stakeholders, what they wish to do in the next years in terms of additional documents, guidances, and so you know what's coming. Difficult to find some of them, but with these links, you should be fine. And with that, Oren, we come almost to the end of my allotted time. I guess there might be time for a question or two if people have them.
Thank you very much, Gert. Great summary of the issues around the European medical device regulations. I'm just wondering if things are going to be exacerbated even more with the new IVD requirements as well.
So this is the friendly start where we already have, and the notified body just had their annual review on certificates and so on. So we actually have moved last year from 1% of the expected certificates issued to 4%. And we moved from 10% of the anticipated application of dossier reviews towards 25%. So with the medical device regulations, although there's still these issues that I mentioned and uncertainties and so on, we're getting in the direction where we need to go. And you see manufacturers still screaming and reducing the portfolio to just make the core products be certified. If you start looking at the same data for the IVDR, well, most of the guidance that we have so far, it's all on the system and on the MDR. There's only like one interesting Q&A document on IVDR to just get some feedback on what you should do. Number of notified bodies, we have 7. And they are very small. The total number of people that can do all that work is less than 100, right? They start growing, but where do you find knowledgeable people that can do these assessments in an industry that was not very well regulated? If you then look at where they are at this stage, they only have a few years left. Well, there's this gradual transition, right? So which was changed. But the funny thing is that the high-risk dossiers have to be done first, and they need common specifications, and they need test labs to be certified to do the tests that are part of that high risk, and that all has to still start, right? So, and if we see how long everything developed, it took like 4 or 5 years to get to where we are with the MDR, so that we're about to start with an expert panel and so on and so on. Now we are starting, and we still have 2 years left. Well, if that had all been in place and the notified bodies would have been designated, we wouldn't manage the high-risk products in 2 years. And now we still have to start developing the whole structure behind it and so on. So yeah, where MDR is painful, but we'll probably manage with, well, everyone chipping in, finding smart solutions, grandfathering here and there, or keeping some products on the market that were approved. For IVDR, this is going to be a nightmare. And so why is that so important? I like your question in a sense, because if we can't test the blood of a patient, the OR shuts down, right? The assessment of patients these days, well, of course, the doctor can see a little bit, and yes, if you need an appendectomy, they probably find it out without all the chemical tests and so on and so on. But without a lot of the IVD testing in place, there is no cancer treatment. There is no, well, and I could list a whole lot of things that are life-threatening in a sense. And so that's seen as a nightmare. And because it's a nightmare, I'm sure there will be a solution. Because at the heart, everyone, whether it's regulator, whether it's someone at the European Commission, whether it's someone in industry, whether it's people in notified body, anyone is spending their life, their work in this area, they all do it basically for the patient, right? So we all have that common goal. And so that common goal should bring us to find a solution. And what the solution is, we'll find it in time. But I'm sure for the IVDR, there will be a solution. Otherwise, the whole system comes to a standstill. Yep,
definitely. Thank you. Melissa, you got a question?
Yeah, I do have a question. So coming from the US side of it, if a company wanted to discuss or get some guidance, which notified body do they approach? Is there some type of mutual recognition that if I talk to the notified body in France and they do my review, that the notified body in Germany will recognize that review and make life easier, or does the U.S. company, or even anybody in the member states, different countries, have to go notified body per notified body in each country to get that approval?
No. So a very good question from that perspective. The basics is that there is this recognition that if one of the notified bodies, and you can actually select a notified body yourself. Trouble is nobody will accept your application. But once one of them would have accepted your application, done the review and the audits, get you a certificate that is valid everywhere in the European Union, in all the countries, including a number of additional countries. So that system stays as it was before with the CE marking. The trouble is that notified bodies are no longer allowed to give guidance. And even if, to get you into the extreme, if they do more than rounds of review, and the last review is not just on some final details, then basically they have to stop the procedure and start from scratch. Because if they take a third round of review, that would be seen as consulting. And they're not allowed legally to do consulting, right? And so that's part of the debate, part of the difficulties why I emphasize that product-specific guidance, that what is good enough is so difficult because it's changing. You're even going to be reviewed against guidances that wasn't published when you submitted your dossier, right? You get the deficiencies, and you cannot help it because it's ongoing review work. And then you're hammered, but nobody tells us what is good enough. The notified body cannot tell what their internal reference standards are. And so this is the big gray area. We don't know what exactly is good enough. And so finally, we're making this shift. That's why I'm so happy that we finally see the first technical guidances on, well, what is good enough, because that gives that reliability. Instead of having the guidance and the discussion between the notified body, at least on paper, we get closer to know what we need to do to pass the 2 rounds of review.
Okay, thank you. It's helpful.
Okay, excellent.
Thank you, Gert. Ebrahim, did you have a question as well?
Yes. Thank you, Dr. Gert, for the interesting presentation. My question is regarding the bottleneck that you mentioned in 2024. From my perspective, I can only see 2 outcomes. One is where the Commission give a leeway, give an extra year because of there is no other way of managing it. The other way is losing access. Many products will lose their certifications, so it's gonna be disastrous, to say the least. So, which one of these 2 outcomes do you expect that will happen?
I guess there will be kind of something in the middle, but both of the scenarios will happen and a bit more. We see already now more and more manufacturers stripping their portfolio again and again and again. So they're really focusing on what are the core products that we need to keep on the market. That helps a little bit to reduce. But nobody has control. Nobody knows who is doing what. Nobody knows which products will be available from which manufacturer. And so what you will get is that, and this is one of these clever ideas, that we will get specific delays or specific additional times for products that are in need. So it could well be that we have sufficient different types of heart valves. But what we do not have is some of the accessories with it, because nobody focused on the accessories. So it could be that the accessories keep their kind of, they get a special status. Like if you had access to the market until a certain date, you can continue to sell them for another 2 years or whatever, right? And so that might even be country specific, because some of the derogations is done by national law. And so what already some manufacturers start doing is apply for derogation to continue to have their products on the market, because they know that they are the only of their kind, or they know that there's only 3 different ones in the market, but they know that their competitors are struggling. And so sometimes even transparent with the competitors confirming they're applying to the authorities in each country separately for a procedure under Article 59. To continue to have that access to make sure that patient care for some critical patients is continued. And so, yeah, that's being done, but you cannot imagine the administrative workload if every manufacturer for every product should have additional approval by exception from each member state separately. That's going to be such a chaos. And how would you then know that this approval was granted, right? So that can be done on exceptions, but not as a rule. But my thinking is that we'll have something, a mixture of all of these scenarios, and maybe some other scenarios as well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Well, we might move on to Ebrahim's presentation. And let me just find your slides. Need to open them up. Where have they gone? Sorry.
No, yeah.
Right. Is that showing?
It's showing, but I don't think this is my PowerPoint.
Okay.
Yeah. Now it's
A
showing.
bit. Excellent.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay. Over to you, Ebrahim.
Thank you very much, Dr. Oren. Hi, everyone. My name is Ebrahim, and I'm going to present today about my capstone project, which I did with Arizona State University for my Master in Clinical Research Management and Regulatory Science. My project was in the medical device and in vitro diagnostics regulatory challenges in the Middle East, North Africa region. Before I start speaking about my project, can you go to the next slide, please? Generally speaking, I'm going to give you a short introduction about myself. Basically, I did my undergrad in biomedical engineering from Ajman University here in United Arab Emirates. I live in Dubai at the moment. I completed recently the Master in Clinical Research Management and Regulatory Science with ASU. Looking to my work experience, I worked as a regulatory affair consultant for a medical device consultancy for 2.5 years. I worked with Hiram, a US medical device manufacturer for hospital beds and hospital hardwares, also as a regulatory affairs specialist for 1 year. I worked with Bioscience as a global RA specialist, which is a manufacturer for hyaluronic acid for 9 months. And I also worked as an on-site auditor for ISO 13485, which is the general quality management system for medical device manufacturers. At the moment, I'm working as a regional, senior regional regulatory affairs specialist with Roche Diagnostics for Middle East region. As you can see, I'm really focused on the medical device industry in my region, in Dubai or in the Middle East regions, and I wanted to do my master program in this as it's something of an interest for me, and it's something that I'm working on a daily basis. Next slide, please. Looking into the reason why I've chosen this project, I can pinpoint 3 main things. Well, the first one would be the impact of the regulatory affairs or the regulations for our healthcare industry or the general healthcare industry. Of course, my study was aiming to bring to the spotlight the regulatory challenges for the medical device manufacturers in our region so that these challenges can be addressed and can be handled appropriately. The study also looked at country-specific challenges. So the study not only looked at the general regional perspective, but also looks into the country-by-country situations. What are the most impacting or most challenging aspects of the regulatory affair process or registration process in the region for the different countries? And it also, the project offered me a personal development. I thought that through probing into the regulatory challenges for different products or different manufacturers and looking into the different regulatory affair professional perspective, it could be a good opportunity to get some actual academic / industry learning experience in addition to actually being able to also network with different regulatory affair professionals in the region. Next slide, please. Now, to give you a general overview of the region, I listed in this slide the main countries or the countries that would be covered under my study, or the Middle East, MENA, Middle East North Africa countries. Here I also listed the authority names which govern the medical device regulation in each specific countries, and I listed, let's call it regulations complexity or the regulatory maturity. For example, some countries, of course, compared to our region, let's say, have a high complexity of regulations. They have a matured regulations. They have ongoing or implemented systems for registration, for technical reviews, for clinical testing, etc. While other countries might be still developing their systems or even establishing from the beginning their systems. So there is some dynamic processes or dynamic changes happening for our region. But maybe here a couple of countries to pinpoint is Egypt and Saudi Arabia, the Egyptian Drug Authority, the EDA, and the Saudi Food and Drug Authority. You can say these are the two main authorities that are followed by different other neighboring countries or different countries in the region. Next slide, please. Looking into the objective of my studies, one of the main objectives was to publish the results of the study so that the appropriate stakeholders and decision makers can take the appropriate actions. Of course, the study is going to look at the challenges, look at the aspect of the registration, whether it's quality, clinical, regional requirements, language requirements, whatever the challenge is. One of the points that I wanted to highlight is that through identifying these challenges and publishing perhaps the results of this study, it would bring more resources or it will bring more attention to these challenges, which in due diligence will cause the stakeholders or the decision makers, whether they are the authority or the manufacturers or any other entities who will have an effect or could support in addressing these challenges. Also, it's going to be a good way to identify common challenges between different countries. So, of course, many countries have different challenges with regards to how mature their regulations, how implemented they are. But one of the good outcomes of the study would be to actually identify what is common, what is less common, what is specific to each country, etc. And finally, the study also categorized the products or the medical devices according to the type of products, the class, or mainly the category of the product, so that if certain products require certain quality or clinical documentation or even language requirements, it will be able to pinpoint such requirements or challenges. Next slide, please. Of course, since I was dealing with the manufacturers of medical devices with different companies, confidentiality was an important point to keep and to mention when doing the data collection with the different regulatory affair professionals from the different organizations. So this is something that as much as possible was highlighted and assured to the people who participated. And even the questionnaire was not looking at any data with regards to the name of the manufacturer or the country he is coming from. It was mainly focusing on the challenges on the category of the product. Next slide, please. The data collection aspect of the project was supposed to be done, or it was done through the survey and the post-survey interview. The survey was an online survey that should took between 10 and 20 minutes. It had only 11 questions, and it was like divided into 4 main sections. One is the general section for the informed consent. The second is for participant information. And when I say information here, I only look at the background, whether it's like pharmaceutical background, medical device engineering background, chemical background, etc. Also, it looked into the countries where the participant worked on, if he worked on one single country or if he worked on different countries, which he can list, which in that way we can identify the challenges that he will list according to the countries that he worked. The second section was regarding the category of the products, whether it's active implantable medical devices, ophthalmological devices like contact lenses, whether it's dental products, the main different categories of the medical devices. The fourth section was looking into the challenges. Basically, in this section, you will identify or rate basically how much the main challenges that were listed have impacted your regulatory projects in the region you have selected for the category you have selected. And finally, the last question was regarding the follow-up interview and sharing the survey result or the study result. The second part was supposed to be the interview. It was also voluntarily for the people who did the survey and would like to or were willing to conduct a 10 to 20-minute interview to probe in a little bit more to these challenges. And it was only looking at 4 main questions with regards to looking back at the history of the challenges and the current situation and the expected future for these challenges or the way that might be addressed or in their perspective. But however, sadly, due to limitation in the time, we were not able to conduct the survey in a way that would be good enough to include in the project, so it was basically discarded. Next slide, please. To encourage the participants or the regulatory affairs professional to participate in the project, it was highlighted to them that this project or this survey would be an opportunity for them to make an impact. Of course, I'm a regulatory affairs professional who is working on MENA as well as they are. So for me and for them, when we find a way that we can highlight the challenges we are facing in order for these challenges to be addressed, it's a good opportunity. It's a good chance for them to pinpoint the main things that they have been struggling with in their project. So it was encouraging for some people to participate so that they can share their feedback. It was also a good opportunity for data collection from the relevant resources. In my perspective, I thought that the people who are actually working on the regulatory projects and the registrations, who are working with the authorities, with the regulations, with the products, are the most appropriate source to identify the regulatory challenges. Because the challenges, like basically the guidelines might be published in a way, but the implementation might be in a different way. So going to the regulators or going to the regulations as the main source was not as efficient as considering or looking into the regulatory affairs professionals, or at least that was my perspective. And finally, it was a way for improving the regulatory operations. Of course, by identifying the challenges and by identifying the product-specific challenges, then it's like half of the issue has been solved. The second half or the remaining steps would be to address the challenges. So identifying a challenge is one of the most important things in addressing it. So this was also something that might be considered to encourage the people to participate. Next slide, please. In this slide, I just took a screenshot of the survey or the online portal that I did the survey to identify where the countries that the people who participated. 43 people participated in my survey. So here I looked into these 43 people, where have they selected the countries that they have worked with. As you can see, many people have selected Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is one of our biggest region financially and regulatory wise. So it's a big cake, if you can say, in our region. Also, you can see Egypt is also one of the bigger ones, big population, big market. Also, the regulations are more matured and very complex. So it's an interesting thing. And lastly, also, you can see Kuwait surprisingly has a large outcome for the people who participated. Next slide, please. I would say this slide or this screenshot would represent the most important thing from my survey. As you can see here, there were 7 main topics that the participant had to rate with regards to how challenging or how disrupting these things were with regards to their regulatory projects. They were rated from 1 to 5, 1 being no challenge faced on this aspect, or 5 major challenge faced that actually caused halting or holding or pausing or even canceling the entire registration project. So just to list them in a very quick way, the first one was the local authority testing and analysis, basically asking for sample for testing. I think this would be more relevant for medical devices that are based on chemicals like hyaluronic acid medical devices. I personally worked on. The second challenge was the local requirements for the technical documentation. Not many countries require local documentation, or this is something that is now becoming more relevant while the region is becoming more matured, but it is something that it actually challenging. As you can see, one of the this 84% listed it as a challenge that were moderate. So it's something, if you look at it and compare it to the other thing, this was one of the more, if not the most impacting aspect. The next thing is the local quality requirement. Of course, quality, when we look at the medical device quality, we look at the ISO 3485 or the quality management requirements. So this is the next thing. Just to go through them quickly, the next one is the interpretation, the local interpretation of the global regulations. Generally speaking, our region follows the global regulation, whether it's the new MDR, as Dr. Gert mentioned, or the IVDR that also is relevant, or the even FDA, the regulation. So many times some challenges arises from our local interpretation in some countries to these global regulations. The next thing was the clinical data or the performance data. This was very relevant as well, as it's become more important with more matured regulation. Then the local Arabic language requirements. And finally, challenging in identifying the regulation. Sometimes it's even challenging to even know what are the regulation in a country XYZ. So these are the 7 main things that were questioned during the survey. Next slide, please. Of course, there was a lot of background analysis and looking into the data, the country specific and the general overall. But to conclude the findings, basically, there are 3 main conclusions in my perspective or my analysis. The first one was that the challenges are country specific and are heavily linked to the maturity of the regulations. Basically, whenever the country is becoming more mature, then the challenges are becoming more impactful, and and the resources that need to be allocated to address these challenges would most likely need to be locally or addressed on the local level, which is bringing me to the next point, that the local level implementation is I would say the best approach to handle these challenges, because there is a huge variety. So there is no one solution that will like solve most of the challenges in the region. So it's better to go on a country by country or case by case scenario. And finally, how our region is dynamic. Like not only the maturity of many countries are becoming more and more complex, but it's becoming in a very fast way. Of course, we are following the global regulations like the MDR, the IVDR, but also many other countries are following the more matured countries. So a solution that or a regulation that was persistent or easy 3 years ago in this country X may not be applicable nowadays. So there need to be a constant vigilance for the new regulations, and the best approaches or the best scenarios to address such regulations. Next slide, please. Yeah, that's basically it. It was an interesting study. It was an interesting project. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank both Dr. Barbara and Dr. Pfeiffer. Dr. Barbara was very supportive during my project. Like I can definitely say that she had a major impact on me succeeding in my project and in my master program. And of course, Dr. Pfeiffer for her continuous support through the past 2.5 years. Yeah, that's my project. I think it's an interesting topic. I'm considering even more advanced, maybe a PhD or something related to this, and because it's a very interesting topic, and you can very diversify the information and go a lot deeper, but a lot more resources, a lot more times will be needed for that. And yeah, that's all from my side. If anyone have any question, feel free to ask.
Thank you very much, Ebrahim. Very interesting results, and hopefully you will keep going and expand on that that survey as well. That'd be interesting. I noted the technical and quality requirements there that you had that were posing challenges, and I was wondering if there was any move in the MENA region to have greater harmonisation and reliance between the different regulators so that you don't have to, replicate everything in all the different countries, setting up more like a regional regulator for medical devices within the region.
Yeah, like even most of the countries are adopting the global regulations, or let's say the global standards, whether it's the EMDR in Europe or the FDA, whether it's ISO 13485 for the quality management system, or whether it's the GHTS standard guidelines. Like there is an ongoing movement to more harmonized standard. However, like still, I think we are a bit far from reaching that point. Many countries are still now starting adopting the regulations. For example, I was just like yesterday in Oman speaking with the Omani authorities as they are starting to implement their regulations. So like it really depends on the country. Some countries are a lot more advanced with regards to how harmonized they are with the global and the regional requirements, and some countries are just now starting. So our region is very dynamic. I can see that there is a lot of harmonization becoming the reality, but there is still a lot more work to be done in order to reach a way that it's similar to EU, where you do your certification within one notified body and you can basically sell your product in 26 or 27 countries. So I think we might reach there, but I think it's going to take some time and some work until we reach.
Okay, thank you. Gert, you had a question?
Yes, I indeed have a question. Excellent talk, Ebrahim, and thank you for sharing the results of your study. Bridging between your talk and my talk, I would have a question on what's happening in the future. You mentioned, and of course we're all aware that a number of countries in MENA region not only follow some of the thinking from different global regulations, but some systems also would kind of have a special route when you have, say, a CE certificate from Europe. So many of the current market approvals in MENA countries are based on that CE mark. If you then see that with the whole struggle we have in Europe, a lot of products will be phased out, at least in terms of having a valid certificate. Do you feel that any preparation is being made inside the different countries in MENA to kind of prepare for that shock that these underlying certificates are no longer valid? Because I cannot imagine that countries would then also immediately want to remove the products from stock in hospitals and so on. So that also needs some solution. Did you pick up any noise that these debates are happening?
Yes, yeah, it's a very interesting topic. Thank you for the question. And I would say 90%, if not even more, of all regional approval of medical devices are based on the CE mark. So we are heavily impacted by the MDR, the IVDR, and the changes that are becoming reality because of the new European regulations. Most of the authorities, or let's say the more impactful authorities, such as the Saudi FDA, are very aware of the bottlenecks that are happening in Europe and the possible challenges that might be caused if some products will lose their certification. Like again, these are, I can see that they are aware of it. Again, the authorities in our region are a lot more working behind closed doors, if you may say. However, I from my perspective, from previous situations such as the COVID situation, such as the scenarios that faced when a product is necessarily needed for a country but is not registered, is not certified yet in the regional requirement, I would say the regulators in our region would give a lot of leeway, because they know that the European regulations are a lot more advanced. They know that most of the products are, at least if they have an MDD certificate, they meet most of the requirements, safety, efficiency, and they know that the impact of not allowing or suddenly discontinuing thousands of products to the patients, the impact of this will be a lot worse than the impact of still allowing an extra year or an extra two for products that just like expired, their MDD expired. And by the way, most of the approvals, as I mentioned, are linked to the MDD. So not only you're going to face a bottleneck in your region, but even in our regions, we're going to face a huge bottleneck for re-registering the product in 2024, when all of their local registration that is based on the CE mark or the CE certificate is going to be expired. So I would say the regulators have an open mind. They are aware of it, and they are aware of the major or the huge risk that is going to be if they suddenly block thousands of products. So I will say they will still allow a healthy flow of medical products into our region, even if products lose their registration.
So that's very reassuring news. Thank you for sharing that detail.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you. Any other questions? We've got time for one more if there are any. No, can't see any hands up. Well, I think we'll draw the webinar to a close. Thank you very much, Gert and Ebrahim, for your excellent presentations. So everyone's learned a lot more now about the EU regulations and the MENA region. So hopefully it's going to enhance our students' learning as well. So thank you very much. And thank you everyone for joining our webinar, and I look forward to seeing you all on our next one in a few months' time.
Thank
Goodbye.
you. Thank you.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.